In 1861 Arizona Territory, a desperate mother faces execution for stealing food to feed her starving sons, until a mysterious stranger risks everything to save her life. When Daniel Crawford challenges the law to rescue Margaret O'Sullivan from the gallows, he discovers that saving her might be the key to his own redemption. But what dark secret from his past is he hiding that could destroy them both? Dirt caked under Margaret's torn fingernails as she clawed at the locked back door of Henderson's General Store. The Arizona sun had not yet risen over Silverbrook this morning in 1861, but desperation never slept. Her two boys huddled behind a stack of empty crates, their hollow cheeks telling the story of 3 days without food. Timothy, only 6 years old, had stopped crying yesterday. That scared Margaret more than his tears ever could. "Mama, I'm so hungry my belly hurts," whispered David, her 8-year-old, trying to be brave. Margaret's heart broke a little more. She pressed her ear against the wooden door, listening for any sound from inside the store. Nothing but silence greeted her. The lock was old and rusty. She had noticed that yesterday, when she had begged Mr. Henderson for credit, he had laughed in her face, his fat belly shaking as he pointed to the sign above his counter. No credit for widows or drifters. Her husband Patrick had been dead for 4 months now. A mining accident had taken him, along with their savings and their hope. The other miners' wives had helped at first, bringing soup and bread, but their own families needed feeding, and charity had its limits. Margaret pulled a bent hairpin from her tangled red hair. Her father back in Ireland had been a locksmith before the potato famine drove them to America. He had taught her things a proper lady should never know. The lock clicked open. "Stay here," she whispered to her boys. "Keep watch for anyone coming." Inside the store, shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Sacks of flour, beans, and rice sat like mountains of gold. Margaret's empty stomach growled so loud she feared it might wake the whole town. She moved quickly through the dim space, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. 3-day-old biscuits sat in a basket near the counter. They were hard as rocks, but they would fill her children's bellies. Margaret wrapped the biscuits in her torn apron and headed for the door. Freedom was just 10 steps away. Well, look what we have here." Margaret froze. The voice came from the shadows near the front entrance. A tall figure stepped into the pale morning light streaming through the window. Sheriff Morrison stood blocking her path, his silver badge catching the early sunlight. His cold blue eyes looked her up and down like she was some kind of wild animal. "Please, Sheriff," Margaret began, but he held up his hand. "Save your breath, woman. I've been watching you for 3 days, waiting to see how far you'd go." His thin lips curved into a cruel smile. "Guess I have my answer." Outside, she could hear Timothy starting to cry. The sound cut through her like a knife. "My boys are starving," she said, lifting her chin despite her fear. "I took 3 old biscuits. That's all." Sheriff Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Theft is theft, no matter how you dress it up. Mr. Henderson has been complaining about missing food for weeks. Now I know why." "I haven't taken anything before today," Margaret protested. "This was the first time, I swear it." "That's what they all say." He grabbed her arm roughly. "Come on, time to face the music." Margaret's mind raced as he dragged her toward the front door. She had heard stories about what happened to thieves in Silverbrook. Judge Parker was known for his harsh sentences. Women had been hanged for less. As they stepped outside, the morning sun hit her face like a slap. A small crowd was already gathering, drawn by the commotion. Margaret saw the baker's wife shaking her head with disgust. The blacksmith spat in the dirt as she passed. Timothy and David ran to her side, grabbing onto her torn skirt with their small hands. Their faces were streaked with tears and dirt. "Don't take our mama away," Timothy begged the sheriff. "We'll be good, I promise." Sheriff Morrison looked down at the boys with cold eyes. "Should have thought about that before your mother decided to become a thief." Margaret felt her world crashing down around her. She had tried so hard to keep her family together after Patrick died. She had taken in washing, cleaned houses, even begged for work at the saloons. Nothing had been enough. The jail stood at the end of Main Street like a hungry beast, waiting to swallow her whole. Margaret could see other women peeking out of windows and doorways, watching her shame parade past their clean, comfortable homes. As Sheriff Morrison pushed her up the wooden steps to the jail, Margaret caught sight of a stranger standing in the shadows across the street. He was tall and dressed in a long, dark coat, despite the heat. His hat was pulled low, but she could see his eyes watching everything with sharp interest. For just a moment, their eyes met. Something in his face made her think of kindness, though she couldn't say why. Then Sheriff Morrison shoved her through the jail door, and the stranger disappeared from view. Inside the cell, Margaret sank onto the hard wooden bench and pulled her boys close. Through the barred window, she could hear the townspeople talking outside. "Hanging's too good for her," someone said. "Those poor boys will be orphans now," said another voice. "Should have thought of that before she turned to stealing," came the harsh reply. Margaret closed her eyes and tried not to think about the rope waiting for her neck. Instead, she thought about the mysterious stranger who had watched her with what looked like compassion. In a town full of hard hearts, why had his eyes seemed different? The sound of hammering echoed through Silverbrook as the sun climbed higher in the desert sky. From her jail cell window, Margaret could see men building something in the town square. She didn't need to ask what it was. "Mama, why are those men making that wooden thing?" David asked, pressing his small face against the bars. Margaret pulled him away from the window. "Come sit with me, sweet boy. Let's not watch them work." But she couldn't stop herself from looking. The gallows took shape, board by board, each nail driven in with the steady rhythm of her approaching doom. Judge Parker had arrived an hour ago on the morning stage, his black robes and grim expression telling everyone what kind of justice he planned to deliver. Timothy had fallen asleep, curled up against her side, exhausted from crying. David sat alert and watchful, trying to be the man of the family at 8 years old. It broke Margaret's heart to see him grow up so fast. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," a voice called from outside the cell. Margaret looked up to see the stranger from earlier, standing in the jail's main room. Up close, she could see he was younger than she had first thought, maybe 35. His dark hair was streaked with early gray, and deep lines around his eyes spoke of hard experiences. Sheriff Morrison sat behind his desk, counting coins. "This here's Daniel Crawford," the sheriff said without looking up. "Says he wants to talk to you before the trial." Daniel stepped closer to the cell bars. "Ma'am, I was wondering if I might ask you a few questions." Margaret studied his face carefully. "Are you a lawyer, Mr. Crawford?" "No, ma'am. Just a concerned citizen." His voice was quiet but steady. "I saw what happened this morning. I'd like to understand your situation better." "Why?" Margaret asked. "You don't know me from Adam's cat. Why would you care what happens to some Irish thief?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. "Let's just say, I've seen what happens when good people get pushed too far." Margaret felt a spark of hope, small as a candle flame in a storm. "What do you want to know? Tell me about your husband. What kind of man was he?" The question surprised her. Most people wanted to know about the theft, not about Patrick. He was a good man, worked hard in the copper mine, never drank too much, came home every night to his family. Her voice grew soft. He used to sing Irish songs to the boys before bedtime. "How did he die?" "Cave-in at the mine. Him and 2 other men got trapped when the tunnel collapsed. They dug for 3 days. But—" Margaret's voice trailed off. Daniel nodded slowly. "And after that, the mining company said it wasn't their fault. No money for the widows, no help with the children. I tried to find work, but most folks don't want to hire a woman with 2 small boys." Margaret's hands tightened on the cell bars. "I cleaned houses, took in washing, even tried to get work cooking at the saloons. Wasn't enough. So you came to stealing food." Margaret's cheeks burned with shame. "Just today, I swear on my mother's grave, this was the first time. My boys haven't eaten in 3 days. Timothy was getting so weak he could barely walk." Daniel glanced at the sleeping child, then back at Margaret. What will happen to them if you can't take care of them anymore? The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. I don't know. The preacher said maybe the Territorial Orphanage in Tucson. But that's 2 days' ride from here. I'd never see them again. Sheriff Morrison looked up from his coin counting. Time's up, Crawford. Judge Parker wants to get this trial started before it gets too hot. Daniel nodded, but didn't move away from the cell. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I want you to know that not everyone in this town thinks you deserve to hang. But enough of them do. Margaret replied bitterly. Maybe. But sometimes one voice speaking up can change a lot of minds. Before Margaret could ask what he meant, the jail door opened and 3 men walked in. Judge Parker led the way, his black robes making him look like a giant crow. Behind him came Mr. Henderson, the store owner, looking pleased with himself. The third man was someone Margaret didn't recognize, a well-dressed gentleman with a gold watch chain. Let's get this over with, Judge Parker announced. I have other towns to visit before the week's out. Sheriff Morrison unlocked the cell door. Come on, woman. Time to face the music. Margaret kissed both her sleeping boys on the forehead, then stood on shaking legs. As she walked past Daniel, he reached out and briefly touched her arm. Don't give up hope, he whispered so quietly, only she could hear. The courthouse was just a large room above the barber shop, but it was packed with people. Every seat was filled, and more folks stood along the walls. Margaret had never seen so many of her neighbors in one place before. Judge Parker took his place behind a wooden table at the front of the room. This court is now in session. We're here to decide the fate of Margaret O'Sullivan, charged with theft from Henderson's general store. Mr. Henderson stood up eagerly. Your Honor, I caught this woman red-handed this morning. She broke into my store and stole 3 biscuits. This is the 3rd time this month I've had food go missing. Did you see her steal anything on those other occasions? Judge Parker asked. Henderson's face reddened. Well, no, but who else could it have been? She's been begging around town for weeks. Begging isn't stealing, Mr. Henderson. Let's stick to what you actually witnessed. Margaret felt a tiny flicker of hope. Maybe the judge would be fair after all. I saw her with my own eyes this morning, Your Honor, sneaking around my store like a common criminal. She had the biscuits wrapped up in her apron, ready to run off with them. Judge Parker turned to Margaret. How do you plead to the charge of theft? Margaret stood up slowly. Her legs felt weak, but her voice was steady. Guilty, Your Honor. I took those biscuits to feed my starving children. A murmur ran through the crowded room. Some voices sounded sympathetic, others angry. The law is clear on theft, Judge Parker said. The penalty is hanging. Margaret felt the world spin around her. Somewhere in the crowd, she heard a woman gasp. Timothy and David would be orphans before the sun set. However, the judge continued, I'm willing to hear if there are any special circumstances that might affect the sentence. Margaret's heart leaped. This was her chance. She opened her mouth to speak about her dead husband and starving children, but before she could say a word, another voice cut through the air. Your Honor, I'd like to invoke the right of settlement. Every head in the room turned toward the back, where Daniel Crawford stood with his hat in his hands and determination written across his face. The crack of Daniel Crawford's boot heel against the wooden boardwalk made every head turn toward the Silver Dollar Saloon. Dust swirled around his long black coat as he stepped into the blazing Arizona sun, his dark eyes scanning the angry crowd that had gathered around Margaret and her terrified boys. What seems to be the trouble here? His voice cut through the desert heat like a cool breeze. Josiah Blackwell puffed up his chest, clearly enjoying his moment of power. Caught this thieving woman red-handed, Crawford. She stuffed 3 of my best biscuits right into that raggedy shawl of hers. Daniel's gaze moved slowly from Blackwell to Margaret, taking in her pale face and the way she held her children close. Timothy had stopped crying, but his small body still shook against his mother's worn dress. David stood slightly in front of his younger brother, his jaw set with the kind of stubborn bravery that only comes from having to grow up too fast. The stranger's weathered hands hung loose at his sides, But Margaret noticed how his fingers seemed to hover near the gun belt around his waist. Not threatening, exactly, but ready. 3 biscuits, Daniel repeated slowly, as if considering the weight of such a crime. And what might those biscuits be worth, Blackwell? 15 cents! The store owner's voice cracked with righteous anger. But that ain't the point, Crawford. Law's the law in this territory. Steal a penny or steal $1,000. It's all the same in the eyes of justice. A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered townspeople. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, nodded her gray head firmly. If we let one person steal, soon everyone will think they can just take whatever they please. Daniel reached into his coat pocket, moving slow and deliberate so no one would mistake his intentions. When his hand emerged, it held a silver dollar that caught the harsh sunlight and threw it back in brilliant flashes. Seems to me there's been some kind of mix-up here, he said, his tone as casual as if he was discussing the weather. This lady is my cousin, Margaret Crawford, visiting from back in Kansas. I sent her to your store to buy supplies for our journey west. He flipped the coin high into the air, where it spun end over end before landing with a solid smack in Blackwell's palm. Keep the extra for your trouble. For a moment, silence stretched across the dusty street like a held breath. Then, Blackwell's eyes narrowed into suspicious slits. Now hold on just 1 minute, Crawford. The store owner closed his fist around the coin, but his voice grew sharper. I've lived in this town for 12 years, and I know every family that comes and goes. I've never seen this woman before in my life. Margaret's heart began to race again. The stranger's lie was unraveling as quickly as he had spun it. And another thing, Blackwell continued, warming to his subject. The Crawford family. I knew your daddy before he passed. God rest his soul. You Crawfords all have that same sandy hair and blue eyes. This woman's got hair black as midnight and eyes green as bottle glass. Several people in the crowd began nodding and whispering among themselves. The stranger's story was falling apart like a house built on sand. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. Cousin on my mother's side. Irish blood runs different than English. Irish, my foot! Blackwell spat into the dust. You're lying through your teeth, Crawford, and we all know it. Young David suddenly stepped forward, his small chin thrust out defiantly. Mister, are you really our cousin? The question hung in the desert air, like smoke from a campfire. Every eye focused on Daniel's face, waiting for his answer. Margaret held her breath, knowing that whatever came next would seal their fate. But before Daniel could respond, the distinctive sound of jangling spurs announced the arrival of Sheriff Morrison. The lean lawman pushed through the crowd, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. What's all this shouting about? Morrison demanded. Heard the commotion from 3 blocks away. Blackwell pointed an accusing finger at Margaret. This woman robbed my store, Sheriff. Took 3 biscuits right off my shelf. Crawford here is trying to cover for her with some fool story about her being his cousin. Sheriff Morrison's cold gray eyes studied Margaret's face, then shifted to Daniel. That true, Crawford? This woman your kin? The moment stretched like a taut rope. Margaret could feel her children pressing closer against her legs, could hear the whispered conversations of the townspeople as they waited for the sheriff's judgment. Then, from somewhere behind the crowd, came the sound of boots on wooden planks. Heavy boots, walking with the measured pace of someone used to being obeyed. Well, well, well. What have we got ourselves here? The voice made Daniel's blood run cold. He turned slowly to see a tall figure in a dusty black suit stepping down from the hotel porch across the street. A silver badge gleamed on the man's chest, the star and shield of a United States Marshal. Marshal Coleman, Daniel said quietly, his voice betraying none of the tension that had suddenly coiled in his gut. Daniel Crawford. Coleman's smile was thin and sharp as a knife blade. Been a long time since our paths crossed. The 2 men stared at each other across the dusty street, and Margaret sensed that something much larger than her small crime was suddenly at play. The marshal's pale eyes held a knowledge that made her stomach twist with dread. Funny thing about family, Coleman continued, stepping closer. The Crawfords I remember from back in Colorado Territory all had light hair and blue eyes. Scandinavian stock, if I recall correctly. Daniel's hand moved almost unconsciously toward his gun, then stopped. Around them, the crowd grew silent, sensing the sudden danger crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. "This supposed cousin of yours," Coleman went on, his voice soft but carrying clearly in the desert stillness. "She doesn't much favor the Crawford line, does she?" Margaret felt the world tilting beneath her feet. Whatever protection the stranger had tried to offer was crumbling away like sand in the wind. And worse, she was beginning to realize that her presence here might have put him in just as much danger as she was in. Marshal Coleman circled Daniel like a hawk studying its prey, his boots making soft scraping sounds in the packed dirt. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the promise of drama that hung thick in the desert air. "You know, Crawford," Coleman said, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of a man who held all the cards. "It's interesting how you keep turning up in places where the law gets complicated." Margaret watched the exchange with growing fear. Something dangerous was happening here, something that went far beyond her stealing 3 biscuits. The way Daniel stood, perfectly still but somehow coiled like a spring, reminded her of a wild animal cornered by hunters. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the marshal's presence. "Coleman, what's your interest in this matter? This is local business." "Oh, but it's not just local anymore, Morrison." Coleman reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "You see, I've been tracking Mr. Precentive Crawford here for quite some time. Haven't I, Daniel?" Daniel said nothing, but Margaret saw his hands slowly curl into fists at his sides. Coleman unfolded the paper with dramatic slowness. "Wanted for questioning in the death of 3 men in Silver Creek, Colorado Territory. Happened about, 3 years ago now." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Henderson clutched her husband's arm, and several people took steps backward, suddenly seeing Daniel Crawford in a very different light. "Now, hold on," Sheriff Morrison interrupted. "Questioning ain't the same as charging. And this is my town, Marshal." "Your town?" "Yes," Coleman agreed with a smile that never reached his eyes. "But murder is federal business when it crosses territorial lines." Timothy began to cry again, pressing his face against his mother's skirt. The sound seemed to break something loose in Daniel's chest. "Those men in Silver Creek," he said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness. "They were burning down a church with a family trapped inside." "So you say?" Coleman replied. "But the only witnesses are dead, aren't they?" Margaret felt sick. She had pulled this man into her troubles, and now he was facing something far worse than helping a thief. But then Daniel did something that surprised everyone. He laughed. It wasn't a happy sound, but it was genuine. "You want to know the truth, Coleman? All of it?" The marshal nodded, clearly thinking he had won. "I killed those 3 men," Daniel said simply. "Shot them down in the street while their church burned behind them." He looked directly at Margaret. "And I'd do it again." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs, but Daniel kept talking, his voice growing stronger. "The family in that church. It was a mother and her 2 children. Little boys, about the same age as these here." He nodded toward Timothy and David. "The men who set that fire thought it was funny, watching them scream." Sheriff Morrison's hand had moved to his gun, but he hadn't drawn it yet. "After I killed them," Daniel continued, "I pulled that family from the flames. Too late for the mother. Smoke had already taken her. But the boys lived. Sent them to their grandmother in California with money for their education." Coleman's smile had faded. "A touching story, Crawford. But murder is still murder, no matter how you dress it up." "Maybe so," Daniel agreed. "But I notice you didn't mention what those 3 men were wanted for in the first place." For the first time, Coleman looked uncomfortable. "That's not relevant to bank robbery in Denver," Daniel said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Murder of a teller and a customer. Rape of a young woman in the vault. You left that part out of your story, Marshall. The crowd's mood was shifting. Margaret could feel it. The fear they'd felt toward Daniel was being replaced by something else. Not approval exactly, but understanding. The territorial judge in Colorado read the evidence. Daniel went on. Ruled it justifiable homicide. I'm not running from the law, Coleman. I'm running from the memories. Coleman's face had gone red with anger and embarrassment. You got any proof of this supposed ruling? Daniel reached slowly into his coat and pulled out a folded document, yellowed with age. Judge Harrison's official decision. Signed and sealed. The marshal snatched the paper and read it quickly, his scowl deepening with each word. Finally, he thrust it back at Daniel. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. You're cleared of murder. But that doesn't change what's happening here and now. He turned to point at Margaret, and his voice grew cold again. This woman is still a thief, and you're still an accomplice to her crime. No, said a new voice from the edge of the crowd. He's not. Everyone turned to see a small figure pushing through the gathered people. David, Margaret's 8-year-old son. His face streaked with tears, but his voice clear and strong. That man never told my mama to steal nothing, David said, looking directly at Marshal Coleman. She did it on her own, to feed us. We've been hungry for days and days. Timothy, encouraged by his brother's bravery, stepped forward too. Mama cried last night, 'cause she didn't want to take them biscuits. But we was so hungry, our bellies hurt. Margaret wanted to hush her children, to keep them from making things worse, but the words seemed stuck in her throat. She ain't bad, David continued, his small voice carrying across the silent street. She just loves us too much to watch us starve. The crowd stirred again, but this time with sympathy rather than anger. Several women were openly weeping, and even some of the men looked moved by the boy's simple honesty. Blackwell shifted uncomfortably, clutching his silver dollar. Well, I mean, the law is still the law. Yes, it is, said Sheriff Morrison, but his voice had lost its harsh edge. The question is, what does the law say about mercy? Coleman's jaw worked silently, clearly frustrated that his moment of triumph had turned into something else entirely. The crowd waited, sensing that whatever happened next would determine not just Margaret's fate, but the kind of town they wanted Silverbrook to be. And in the silence, Margaret heard something that made her heart skip, the distant rumble of thunder from the mountains to the west, promising the possibility of rain. The iron bars felt cold against Margaret's forehead as she pressed her face to the tiny window of the jail cell. Stars twinkled like diamonds scattered across black velvet, but she couldn't see their beauty tonight. All she could think about was the wooden platform being built in the town square, where tomorrow morning she would take her final breath. Mama, why are you crying? Timothy's small voice cut through the darkness like a knife through butter. Margaret wiped her eyes quickly and turned to face her two sons. They sat huddled together on the thin mattress that served as their bed, their eyes wide with fear they didn't fully understand. David, the older boy, kept his arm around his little brother's shoulders, trying to be brave even though his own chin trembled. I'm not crying, sweetheart, Margaret lied, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass on her face. I'm just thinking about your father. The mention of their father made both boys sit up straighter. Patrick O'Sullivan had died 2 winters ago when a mine collapsed outside Phoenix, leaving his family with nothing but memories and empty pockets. Margaret had sold everything they owned just to buy passage to Silverbrook, hoping to find work in the growing town. Tell us about Papa again, David whispered, scooting closer to his mother. Margaret sat down on the mattress and pulled both boys into her arms. Their small bodies felt so thin, so fragile, like baby birds that might break if she held them too tight. The smell of their unwashed hair reminded her of better days when she could afford soap and warm baths. Your father was the strongest man in all of Ireland, she began, her voice soft as morning mist. He could lift a grown horse over his head and carry 3 bags of grain at the same time. Timothy giggled, despite their terrible situation. Really, Mama? A whole horse? Well, maybe not a whole horse, Margaret admitted, tickling his ribs until he squirmed. But he was strong enough to carry both of you boys on his shoulders while walking 5 miles to town. Outside their cell, she could hear the sounds of hammering echoing through the night. Each bang of the hammer felt like a nail being driven into her own coffin. The townspeople were working by lamplight, eager to have their gallows ready for the morning's entertainment. Sheriff Morrison walked past their cell, his keys jingling like tiny bells on his belt. He stopped and stared at them through the bars, his weathered face showing no emotion at all. "You got any last words you want me to write down?" he asked, pulling out a small notebook from his shirt pocket. Margaret's heart began beating so fast, she thought it might burst. "What happens to my boys after?" The sheriff scratched his gray beard with the tip of his pencil. "Reverend Pike says he'll take them to the Territorial Orphanage in Tucson. It's a good place. They'll learn to read and write, maybe even get adopted by a nice family." The thought of her children being separated and sent away to live with strangers made Margaret's stomach twist like a rope. She had heard terrible stories about orphanages, places where children worked from dawn to dusk and rarely saw enough food to fill their bellies. "Could they stay together?" she asked, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "Can't promise nothing," Morrison replied, closing his notebook with a snap. "The orphanage takes what it takes." After the sheriff left, Margaret held her boys closer and began humming an old Irish song her own mother had taught her. The melody drifted through the cell like a gentle breeze, calming their fears and helping them drift toward sleep. But sleep would not come for Margaret. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel Crawford's face, the stranger who had tried to save her with his quick thinking and silver dollar. Why had he helped her? What did he want in return? Hours crawled by like wounded animals. Margaret listened to the sounds of the night, crickets chirping in the distance, a dog barking somewhere in town, the occasional laugh from the saloon across the street. Normal sounds of normal people living normal lives, while she sat waiting to die. Around midnight, she heard footsteps approaching the jail, heavy boots walking slowly, as if their owner carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. The footsteps stopped outside the building, and Margaret held her breath. A key turned in the lock of the main door, and she heard quiet voices talking in the front room. One voice belonged to Sheriff Morrison, but the other was deeper, more familiar. Her heart jumped like a startled rabbit. Daniel Crawford had come to see her. 5 minutes, Morrison's voice carried back to the cells. "That's all I can give you." Daniel's shadow appeared at the bars of her cell, tall and dark against the lamplight from the front room. His hat sat low on his head, hiding his eyes, but she could feel him looking at her sleeping children. "Why?" Margaret whispered, careful not to wake the boys. "Why did you try to help me?" For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. Then he removed his hat, and Margaret could see his face clearly for the first time. Lines of sadness ran deep around his eyes, and his mouth was set in a hard line that spoke of old pain. "I had a family once," he said quietly. "A wife and a little girl. They died of fever 3 years ago, and I couldn't save them." Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks again. But this time, they were not just for herself. "I'm sorry. When I saw you today, with your boys," Daniel's voice cracked like dry wood, "I saw my Ellen, trying to protect our daughter. I saw myself failing again." The hammering outside had stopped, which meant the gallows was finished. Come morning, Margaret would climb those wooden steps and feel the rope around her neck, just like dozens of other people who had broken the law in frontier towns across the territory. "Will you watch over Timothy and David?" she asked, gripping the iron bars until her knuckles turned white. "Will you make sure they stay together?" Daniel reached through the bars and placed his rough hand over hers. His skin was warm and calloused from years of hard work, and his touch made her feel less alone in the darkness. "I promise," he said. The rooster's crow split the dawn air like an axe through kindling, announcing the arrival of Margaret O'Sullivan's final day on Earth. She had not slept at all during the long night, choosing instead to memorize every detail of her sleeping son's faces. The way Timothy's hair curled behind his left ear, the small scar on David's chin from when he fell off their neighbor's fence back in Phoenix. Sunlight crept through the small window like golden honey, warming the cold stone walls of the jail cell. Margaret could already hear people gathering in the town square, their voices mixing together like water in a stream. Some sounded excited, others serious, but all were drawn to witness the morning's grim spectacle. "Mama?" David's voice was thick with sleep as he rubbed his eyes. "Is it time?" Margaret's heart felt like it was being squeezed by an invisible fist, but she managed to smile as she smoothed down his messy hair. "Not yet, my brave boy. We still have a little time together." Timothy sat up and looked around the cell, his blue eyes wide with confusion. At 6 years old, he didn't fully understand what was about to happen, but he could feel the heavy sadness that hung in the air, like storm clouds. "Are we going home today?" he asked hopefully. Before Margaret could answer, the sound of jingling keys announced Sheriff Morrison's approach. He walked slowly, as if he didn't want to reach their cell any more than they wanted him to arrive. His usually stern face looked troubled, and Margaret noticed his hands shaking slightly as he sorted through his keys. "Time to go, ma'am," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. Margaret knelt down and took both boys in her arms, holding them as tight as she dared without hurting them. She breathed in their scent, trying to store the memory in her heart forever. "I want you both to remember something very important," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tears flowing down her cheeks. "Your mama loves you more than all the stars in the sky, more than all the water in the ocean. Nothing that happens today will ever change that." "Don't go, Mama," Timothy cried, wrapping his small arms around her neck. "Please don't go." David, trying to be the man of the family at only 8 years old, wiped his eyes with his sleeve and stood up straight. "We'll be good, Mama. We'll be real good." Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Reverend Pike is here to take the boys. He's waiting outside." Margaret kissed each of her sons on the forehead, whispering a quick prayer in Irish that her own mother had taught her long ago. Then she stood up and smoothed down her faded dress, trying to look dignified as she prepared to face her fate. The walk from the jail to the town square felt both endless and far too short. Margaret's legs moved like they belonged to someone else, carrying her forward while her mind screamed at her to run. But there was nowhere to go in this vast desert, and running would only make things worse for Timothy and David. The entire population of Silverbrook had gathered to watch the hanging. Men in dusty work clothes, women in their Sunday dresses, children perched on their father's shoulders for a better view. Margaret had never seen so many people in one place, all staring at her like she was some kind of dangerous animal. The gallows stood in the center of the square like a wooden monster, its crossbeam casting a dark shadow across the platform. The rope hung perfectly still in the morning air, waiting to do its terrible job. Margaret's steps faltered when she saw it, and Sheriff Morrison had to steady her with a gentle hand on her elbow. "Easy now," he murmured. "Just a few more steps." At the edge of the crowd, Margaret spotted Reverend Pike holding Timothy and David's hands. The boys were crying silently, their faces pale as winter snow. Seeing them gave Margaret the strength she needed to keep walking. Near the back of the crowd, almost hidden in shadow, stood Daniel Crawford. His dark coat made him nearly invisible, but Margaret could feel his eyes on her. He had kept his promise to come, even though there was nothing more he could do to help. Judge Whitman, a fat man with a gray beard and tiny spectacles, climbed onto the platform carrying a large book. He opened it and began reading in a voice that sounded like he was announcing the weather instead of someone's death. "Margaret O'Sullivan, you have been found guilty of theft in the amount of 15 cents. According to the laws of the Arizona Territory, the penalty for theft is death by hanging." The crowd murmured their approval, but Margaret barely heard them. All her attention was focused on her sons, trying to send them all her love through her eyes alone. The hangman, a thin man with shaking hands, approached her with the rope. He smelled like whiskey and sweat, and his face was pale as milk. Margaret realized he was probably more scared than she was. "Any last words?" Judge Whitman asked, closing his book with a snap. Margaret looked out over the crowd, at all these people who had come to watch her die. Most of them were good folks just trying to make a living in a hard place. But today, they wanted to see justice done, even if it meant taking a mother away from her children. "I am not sorry for trying to feed my boys," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "A mother's love knows no law higher than her children's hunger." Some people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably at her words. Others nodded in understanding. A few women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The hangman placed the rope around Margaret's neck, and she closed her eyes, saying a final prayer for Timothy and David's future. The rough fibers scratched against her skin like tiny thorns, and she could smell the oil that had been used to treat the rope. Judge Whitman raised his hand to give the signal, and Margaret prepared to meet her maker. But before he could bring his hand down, a voice rang out across the square like a church bell on Sunday morning. "Stop! I invoke the right of settlement." Margaret's eyes flew open, and she saw Daniel Crawford pushing through the crowd, a leather bag clutched in his hand. His face was determined, and his eyes blazed with a fire she had never seen before. The crowd began to buzz with excitement and confusion. The right of settlement was an old law that few people remembered, and even fewer had ever seen used. Judge Whitman's face turned red as a summer tomato, and he sputtered like a tea kettle coming to boil. Daniel climbed the steps to the platform, his boots ringing like bells against the wooden boards. He stood beside Margaret, and she could smell the leather of his coat and the soap he had used that morning. "State your business, Crawford," Judge Whitman demanded, clearly annoyed by this interruption to his morning's work. Daniel opened the leather bag and poured its contents onto a small table beside the gallows. Gold and silver coins spilled out like water from a broken dam, more money than most people in Silverbrook had ever seen in one place. "I claim responsibility for this woman's debt and her future conduct," Daniel announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the square. "I offer $50 in payment, 10 times the value of what was taken." The crowd gasped at the sight of so much money. $50 was enough to buy a horse, a wagon, and supplies for a month-long journey. It was more than most working men earned in half a year. But even as hope began to bloom in Margaret's chest, like a desert flower after rain, she saw Marshall Coleman pushing his way through the crowd. His face was dark as a thundercloud, and his hand rested on the gun at his hip. Something told Margaret that Daniel Crawford's troubles were just beginning. The rope scratched against Margaret's neck like sandpaper as she stood on the wooden platform, watching a man she barely knew march through the crowd like he owned the whole territory. Daniel Crawford's boots hit each step with the sound of thunder. His long black coat flapped behind him in the morning wind. Every person in Silverbrook turned to stare as he climbed toward the hangman's platform where Margaret waited to die. "I invoke the right of settlement," his voice boomed across the town square. Old Mrs. Henderson dropped her basket of eggs. Little Billy Thompson stopped throwing rocks at a stray dog. Even the horses tied to the hitching posts seemed to prick up their ears. Nobody had heard those words spoken in Arizona Territory for more than 10 years. Sheriff Morrison scratched his gray beard. "Now, hold on there, Crawford. You sure you know what you're asking? The law says any citizen can pay the debt of a condemned person and take charge of their future behavior." Daniel pulled out a leather bag that clinked with silver coins. "I'm prepared to do that." Margaret's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst. Her 2 boys pushed through the crowd until they stood right at the front, their dirty faces streaked with tears. "Mama!" Timothy cried out, reaching his small arms toward the platform. The hangman, a thin fellow named Pete, who usually worked at the blacksmith shop, looked confused. He'd never had anyone stop his work before. "Sheriff, what am I supposed to do now?" Before Morrison could answer, Marshall Coleman stepped forward. His silver badge caught the sunlight like a mirror. "This is mighty interesting, Crawford, but I'm curious about something." Daniel's jaw went tight. Margaret could see muscles working under the skin of his face. "What's that, Marshall?" "Well, the right of settlement usually gets used for family members. Husbands saving wives, fathers saving sons." Coleman's cold eyes moved from Daniel to Margaret and back again. But you two aren't family, are you? The crowd buzzed like angry bees. Margaret felt sweat running down her back despite the morning chill. She didn't understand what was happening, but she could feel danger in the air like smoke from a distant fire. The law doesn't say anything about family, Daniel replied. His voice stayed calm, but Margaret noticed his hands had turned into fists. That's true, said Judge Patterson, an old man who'd been watching from his chair outside the courthouse. The right can be invoked by any citizen willing to pay the debt and take responsibility. Blackwell, the store owner, pushed through the crowd. His face was red as a tomato. This is nonsense! She stole from me! She should hang! How much were those biscuits worth? Daniel asked. 15 cents. Daniel reached into his leather bag and pulled out a silver dollar. Then another. Then another. He kept pulling out coins until he had a small pile shining on the wooden platform. $50, he announced. That should cover the biscuits, your hurt feelings, and the cost of building this gallows. Margaret had never seen so much money in her whole life. Where had this stranger gotten such wealth? And why was he spending it on her? Now wait just a minute, Coleman said, stepping closer to the platform. I think folks deserve to know who they're dealing with here. Margaret's stomach dropped like a stone down a well. The marshal knew something about Daniel that could ruin everything. Daniel Crawford, Coleman continued, his voice getting louder so everyone could hear, used to be a very different man. Didn't you, Crawford? Every man has a past, Marshal. Some pasts are more interesting than others. Coleman smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Tell me, how's a drifting cowboy come by 50 silver dollars? That's more money than most folks see in a year. The crowd pressed closer. Margaret could smell their sweat and excitement. They loved a good mystery almost as much as they loved a good hanging. Daniel's hand moved toward his coat, and Margaret saw something that made her blood freeze. The handle of a gun stuck out from a holster hidden under his jacket. The money's honestly earned, Daniel said. I'm sure it is. Coleman's hand also moved toward his weapon. Just like the money you earned in that poker game in Denver 3 years ago. The one where Jake Morrison got shot. Sheriff Morrison's head snapped up. Morrison's my brother's name. Your late brother, Coleman corrected. Shot dead over a card table by a man who claimed self-defense. Margaret felt the world spinning around her. Her children's savior might be a killer, but as she looked down at Daniel's face, she didn't see a murderer. She saw pain so deep, it made her own troubles seem small. Jake Morrison drew first, Daniel said quietly. 12 witnesses saw it happen. Witnesses can be bought, Coleman replied, or they can tell the truth. Daniel's voice got harder. Jake Morrison was drunk and angry about losing. He called me a cheat and went for his gun. I defended myself. The crowd murmured and shifted. Some folks stepped back. Others leaned forward, hungry for more drama. Self-defense or not, Coleman said, that doesn't explain why you're here now, playing hero for a woman you don't even know. Margaret found her voice. Maybe some people help others because it's right, not because they have to. Coleman laughed. Pretty words from a thief. She's not a thief. David, her 8-year-old son, marched up to the platform. His small face was fierce with anger. She's the best mama in the whole world, and she only took those biscuits because we were hungry. Timothy joined his brother. We ain't eaten for 3 days. The crowd got quiet. Even Coleman looked a bit uncomfortable. Old Judge Patterson stood up from his chair. I've heard enough. The right of settlement has been properly invoked. The debt has been paid with interest. This woman is free to go. He banged his walking stick on the ground like a gavel. The hangman Pete began untying the rope from around Margaret's neck with shaking fingers. But Coleman wasn't finished. She's free to go, but Crawford isn't free of his past. There's still questions about that Denver shooting. Daniel climbed down from the platform and helped Margaret down the steps. His hand was strong and warm, and it steadied her shaking legs. There are always questions, Marshal, he said. The trick is learning which ones matter. As they walked away from the gallows, Margaret heard Coleman call out, One last time. This isn't over, Crawford. Daniel didn't turn around, but Margaret felt his hand tighten on her arm. She looked up at his weathered face and saw something that scared her more than the hanging rope had. Spring came early to Arizona Territory in 1862, painting the desert with tiny wildflowers that looked like scattered jewels across the brown earth. Margaret Crawford, she still wasn't used to her new last name, stood in the doorway of their small adobe house, watching her husband teach the boys how to shoe a horse. The morning sun made everything look golden and perfect, like a picture in one of those fancy books from back east. But pictures didn't show the sleepless nights, or the way Daniel sometimes woke up shouting names she didn't recognize. Pictures didn't show the fear that lived in her chest like a cold stone, even on the warmest days. "Easy now, Timothy," Daniel was saying to her youngest son. "The horse can feel if you're scared. Animals always know." Timothy nodded seriously, his small hands gripping the hammer Daniel had given him. At 7 years old, he'd grown 2 inches since they'd left Silverbrook 6 months ago. Both boys had filled out, their cheeks round and pink with health. David, now 9, was already tall enough to look a full-grown horse in the eye. "Can I try the big hammer next, Pa?" Margaret's heart still skipped when the boys called Daniel Pa. They'd started doing it without anyone telling them to. Just a few weeks after the wedding, Daniel had cried the first time Timothy said it, though he'd turned away so the boy wouldn't see. "In a few years," Daniel replied. "When your arms are stronger." A dust cloud appeared on the horizon, moving fast toward their little ranch. Margaret shaded her eyes with her hand, trying to make out who was coming. Visitors were rare out here, 20 miles from the nearest town. Daniel saw it too. His whole body went still, like a deer that's caught a hunter's scent. "Boys, take the horse back to the corral," he said quietly. "But Pa, we weren't finished." "No." Something in his voice made both children obey instantly. They led the big brown mare away without another word. The dust cloud got closer, and Margaret could make out 3 riders. Her mouth went dry when she recognized the man in front, Marshall Coleman. Daniel walked to the house and pulled his rifle down from the wall. He checked to make sure it was loaded, then stepped outside to stand beside Margaret. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "you take the boys and hide in the root cellar. Don't come out until you're sure it's safe." "Daniel, what's going on?" The riders pulled up in front of their house. Marshall Coleman sat tall in his saddle, flanked by 2 deputies Margaret had never seen before. All 3 men had their hands resting on their guns. "Crawford," Coleman said, by way of greeting. "Marshall." Daniel's voice was calm, but Margaret could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "We need to talk." "About what?" Coleman smiled that cold smile Margaret remembered from the day at the gallows. "About Jake Morrison. Turns out there's some new information about that shooting in Denver." One of the deputies, a young man with nervous eyes, spoke up. "We got a witness, says you started the fight. Says you were the one cheating at cards." Daniel's knuckles went white where he gripped the rifle. "What witness?" "Everyone who was there testified at the trial." "This one just came forward," Coleman said. "Fellow named Briggs. Says he was scared to talk before, but his conscience got the better of him." Margaret had heard Daniel talk about that night in Denver, late at night when he thought she was asleep. How Jake Morrison had been drinking and losing money, and getting meaner by the hour. How Morrison had called him a cheat and a coward and finally gone for his gun. "Briggs is lying," Daniel said. "Maybe, maybe not. Either way, there's going to be a new trial." Coleman leaned forward in his saddle. "You can come with us peaceful-like, or we can do this the hard way." Margaret stepped forward. "You can't just take him. He has a family now." "Should have thought of that before he married a thief," one of the other deputies said. The words hit Margaret like a slap. Even though the charges against her had been dropped, some people would always see her as the woman who'd almost hanged for stealing. Daniel raised his rifle slightly. "You boys need to leave my property." "Can't do that, Crawford." Coleman's voice got harder. "You're under arrest." The world seemed to slow down. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat. loud as thunder in her ears. She could smell the desert sage and the horses and the fierce sweat from the nervous deputy. Then she heard something else. A small voice, high and scared. "Pa?" Timothy had crept around the corner of the house. His blue eyes were huge in his pale face. "Get back inside, son," Daniel said gently. But Timothy didn't move. He stood there, looking at the marshal and his men, and Margaret could see him remembering another day when men with badges had threatened his family. "You can't take our pa," Timothy said, his voice getting stronger. "He didn't do nothing wrong." David appeared beside his younger brother. "He saved our mama. Heroes don't go to jail." Coleman laughed. "Heroes? Boy, your new daddy killed a man in cold blood." "You're lying," David shouted. The nervous deputy's hand moved toward his gun. Margaret saw it happening like a bad dream, everything slow and terrible and unstoppable. But before anyone could draw, a new voice cut through the tension. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Everyone turned. An old man stood at the edge of their property, holding a shotgun that looked older than he was. It was Sam Weatherby, their nearest neighbor, a grizzled rancher who lived 3 miles east. "Sam," Daniel said, "this isn't your fight. When 3 armed men come to threaten my neighbors, it becomes my fight." Sam spit into the dust. "Besides, I got something to say about this Jake Morrison business." Coleman's eyes narrowed. "You weren't in Denver 3 years ago, old man." "No, but I was in Tucson 2 weeks ago. Met a fellow named Briggs in a saloon, drunk as a skunk and bragging about how he was going to get rich, testifying against some cowboy who killed Jake Morrison." The marshal's face went red. "That doesn't prove anything." "Proves Briggs is lying for money." Sam shouldered his shotgun. "Now, seems to me you boys should get back to chasing real criminals instead of harassing honest folks." For a long moment, nobody moved. Margaret could feel the weight of the moment, balanced on a knife's edge between peace and violence. Finally, Coleman wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over, Crawford. We'll be back with a warrant." As the 3 lawmen rode away, Margaret's legs gave out. She sat down hard in the dirt, her whole body shaking. Daniel knelt beside her. "It's going to be all right." "Is it?" She looked up at him. This man she'd married, this stranger who'd saved her life. Will they really come back? Daniel was quiet for a long time. Finally he said, "Maybe, but if they do, we'll face it together." Timothy and David ran to them, wrapping their arms around both adults in a fierce hug. Sam Weatherby walked over and patted Daniel on the shoulder. "You got good neighbors, Crawford, don't forget that." As the sun climbed higher in the desert sky, Margaret looked around at her small family and her unexpected ally. Maybe the future was uncertain. Maybe Marshal Coleman would return with his warrant and his questions. But right now, in this moment, she had something she'd never had before. She had people who would fight for her. She had a place that felt like home. And sometimes, that was enough to build a whole life on. The wildflowers nodded in the desert breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out as it soared toward the endless blue sky.